Good morning, everybody. Welcome to session 2 of our food justice, climate justice presentation. Yesterday you heard from Brian Tokar on the climate justice part. And this morning, this is me, Grace Gershuny. I will be leading the presentation on the food justice piece, and I will be also we'll do a similar sort of group breakout discussion. I've posted some instructions for what we'll be talking about in our small groups, and again reporting back and having question and answers as much as possible. We had a great discussion yesterday. I tried to integrate some of the questions of yesterday into what I'm talking about today, so hopefully I'll be able to squeeze it all in and still generate some interesting discussion. Do you want to say anything, Brian, to start off?
Yeah, just to reinforce some of the lessons from the discussion yesterday, which for me reinforced the extent to which climate politics touches on every area of life and every area of the potential for genuine social transformation and revolution. And I think, if anything, issues around food politics and the food system are even more so. So looking forward to today's discussion, and we can talk about more about some of the connections between the two themes, which have always been very intimately related, as came up several times, both Monday night with Sylvia and yesterday morning.
Yes, and so I will also review some of the information about the food system and climate change. So maybe without further ado, I will start my presentation and talk about the question. The real question for me is not so much just food justice, but it's also food sovereignty. And my little equation, which which I will share with you as my introductory. And
Grace, while you're setting that up, how do you want your time prompt? Is the chat okay, or do you want it verbally?
Verbally would probably be better.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay.
Got it.
So I've got, okay, let's share. So can you all see that? Are we good?
Yes.
Screen share working?
Yes.
Okay. So my little equation is that food sovereignty and land justice equals food justice. That land justice is maybe the primary underlying need, and the question of ownership of land is the primary and underlying change that we need to see, and that capitalism has turned into something that is bought and sold in a marketplace, and that isn't what a free ecological society can live on. So I am basing a lot of this obviously on the idea that in this country, the land has been stolen from the stewardship and of the indigenous community. There was no concept of land ownership by the Native American tribes, as far as I've ever heard, and somebody can correct me if that's wrong. There were tribal territories, but the idea of owning a piece of the earth was completely foreign to them. And that's a problem in many other places in the world. And a lot of the information that I am using in this case comes from this wonderful newsletter that recently came out from that's the Nyaleni Project, which created the idea of food sovereignty, elaborated on it, and is a coalition of many international grassroots groups, primarily La Via Campesina, and which has highlighted the problem of land grabs and land justice as the defining question for this generation. What did I do here? Okay. So some of the information that I'm using is coming from this, but this is an ongoing project that is also highlighted by the organization called GRAIN, G-R-A-I-N, which has done a lot in terms of international food and agriculture issues and land grabbing, meaning the dispossession of people from smallholder lands that they may have insecure titles or tenure for by corporate agribusiness in order to extract the resources and profit. So with that, I would also want to talk more about some of the lexicon of the food movements, just to give you a sense of the evolution of the term of food sovereignty. A number of years ago, maybe 20 years ago, we were talking about food security as the question, which means that people who have a right to have access to food, and it was adopted by a fair number of policy people, but that has really is really far from enough. And the question of food sovereignty and food justice became much more prominent in maybe the past 10 years or so. And the food justice lens, according to the Nyaleni newsletter, is it examines questions of access to healthy, nutritious, culturally appropriate food, as well as ownership and control of land, credit, knowledge, and technology and other resources. What kinds of food traditions are valued? How has colonialism affected the food system's development, and more? And the concept of food sovereignty is defined as people's right to healthy and culturally appropriate food produced through ecologically sound and sustainable methods, and their right to define their own food and agricultural systems. So that's what the Nyaleni newsletter has defined it, as. And then the BIPOC farming movement, particularly Leah Penniman in her work at Soulfire Farm, who's the author of Farming While Black, has coined the term food apartheid to recognize not just food deserts, and that's in place of the idea that, oh, there are communities, urban communities in particular, but certainly rural ones as well, where access to fresh, nutritious food is very, very difficult, and she calls that, and they call that, food apartheid. So to go on to the question of food and climate change, Brian had a chart yesterday about the contribution of the food and ag system to climate change. This is a similar one from grain. What I think I want to call your attention to just a bit about this, and this is just the portion of the 30 to 40% of greenhouse gas emissions that are attributed to the food system. So this is how it breaks down according to grain, according to their I think this is a few years ago now, maybe 2016 figures, but the amount that goes to processing, transport, packing, and retail is, pretty hefty, but not huge. So the idea that only local food is going to significantly reduce the climate footprint isn't all that significant. Land use change and deforestation is at least as significant. Well, agricultural production, I think, includes the livestock component, which there have been some inflated figures about livestock's contribution to greenhouse gas emissions, and this kind of puts it in more perspective. Now, what I found interesting about this is the other non-food related emissions, and what the heck is that? And as far as I can tell, that obviously close to the majority of food system emissions refers to the agricultural inputs industry. So not actual production on the farm, but agricultural inputs, which includes a large chunk of the manufacture of toxic chemicals, the manufacture of farm equipment, certainly, and the manufacture of nitrogen for use as a fertilizer. So that's something important to keep in mind. I spend a lot of time in my life thinking about solutions to climate change based on soil quality. And so I just put this slide back in with a number of strategies and practices that organic agriculture, regenerative agriculture, whatever kind of agriculture you want to label it, is going to produce a positive benefit in terms of agricultural practices. And there's definitely a huge movement, which I am a part, which is advocating for soil building and healthy soil as the primary way of reversing, not just mitigating, but reversing climate change through cooling the planet, through changing the water cycle. This, of course, is going to require a huge reconstruction of the whole food and agriculture system in order to accomplish it. but that's where I see it start. I've already talked about the definition of food justice, so I'll skip over that at this point and just start out with the idea that as far as food system change, I see as the leading edge of the revolution that we're all working towards. That it's the common understanding and basic necessity of people that people are most aware of. I mean, water, housing, all of those things are certainly obviously important and need to be retaken from centralized corporate control. But the food system is what everybody can relate to. And the awareness of the need to change the food system has never been greater. And I will just also use a quote from Malik Yakini, who is from the Detroit Black Agriculture Network. And his statement is that food is a lens for shifting power. And I think that that's how I've seen it all along. And the high vulnerability of the people of color in communities, BIPOC communities, at this time during the COVID-19 epidemic has also highlighted the injustice of the food system. And the food system change, the fragility of the capitalist food system has been so highlighted with, I mean, incredible explosion in demand for information and resources on home and community gardening and CSAs, but as historically essential exploited essential workers in the food industry, BIPOC populations have been hardest hit. If you think about the meatpacking plants in this country that have become hotspots, that have turned rural communities into hotspots for COVID-19 because of the abysmal working conditions and people aren't being protected. So, and I have some information, just very recent information about data on the rise of COVID-19 amongst those communities that I can post later. I think I'll have to just post a whole list of resources later on. But the historic underpinnings of capitalism and the food system in this country and in many, and similarly in other places in the world, is really related to the institution of slavery, which many people don't understand quite fully how huge an impact this has been, and how incredibly dominant the whole economy, the whole slave economy was to the wealth not just of the southern states, but of the North as well. And as the foundation for the industrialization of the textile industry, which was, of course, the foundation of capitalism throughout the Northern Hemisphere. And this set of infographics from Yes Magazine really is very helpful in tracing the whole way that this has continued, that this legacy of domination and racism has continued to undergird the loss of land by communities of color, the prevention of land ownership, and the prevention of access to any kind of justice, let alone racial justice and food justice. So I think that this is information that everybody should reflect on and continue to understand as we move along. And some of the history of leadership, and that this is where I have found the most inspiration in recent times. Really, it's only in the last, I don't know, and you know, let me just back up a little bit. The organic movement, which is where I come from, has been rightfully understood as a rather elitist, completely privilege dominated movement for many, many years. And its origins, as I've talked about in other contexts, really have some mixed background, including various eco-fascist origins. So the idea that that people of color can't afford healthy food is really one of the back stories that we've only recently been working aggressively to address in the organic movement, and which is really been only in the, I don't know, maybe 10 years since we've really been focusing more and more on leadership by frontline communities. There are organizations such as Just Food in New York that have become more people of color led. Originally started out as a fairly privileged organization and began learning to educate and integrating more allyship and collaboration, and now is pretty much Black led, and a lot more activism in terms of the farm worker community. In Vermont, there's a group called Migrant Justice, which works on behalf of dairy farm workers who are pretty much all undocumented, since they need to be year-round. They can't get guest worker documentation. So the idea of how the historically Black community has really contributed in many, many ways to the food movement is a really important one. Starting with the Black Panthers, starting earlier than the Black Panthers, but the Black Panthers were primarily one of the first organizations to think about providing free meals to school children, which has now become kind of part and parcel of our government policy, and is really one of the lifelines right now during the pandemic of children who otherwise are going hungry in the summer. They're still delivering meals through the school programs, putting them on school buses and bringing them out to the residences, which is amazing. And the other story that I would like to highlight is the origin of the Community Land Trust, which began with a collaboration between Bob Swan, who was the founder of the Schumacher Center for New New Economics, I believe it used to be called the Schumacher Society in Great Barrington, Massachusetts. We have some connections between them and the ISE, and Bob Swan was a socialist who was committed to rural revitalization and the idea of the commons of land ownership. And he worked with Charles and Shirley Sherrod of Georgia to create the New Communities Farm in the early to mid 60s. And they actually took a fact-finding trip to Israel to visit the kibbutz movement and find out how those things were run and modeled. The very first community land trust in the U.S. on that model. So New Communities Farm was really the first in what has now become an institution that many people are working with, and in particular the recent group that we've been in contact with is the Northeast Farmers of Color Land Trust, and they are working on developing access to land by the BIPOC community. It's organized through Soul Fire Farm, who offer a reparations map of the U.S. for communities of color who are looking for support for access to land or looking for donations of land at this point. And you can sign up based on where you want to donate and support a particular farm project of communities of color. And there are other organizations such as the Agrarian Trust working to develop rural community land trusts that are specifically oriented towards access to land for underprivileged and marginalized populations, which is something that I'm terribly interested in and hope to be able to contribute to more. This is a very, very brief overview. How am I doing on time, Brian?
You've got about 5 or 6 more minutes.
Okay, perfect. So I will move on to the conclusion and talk a little bit more about what I'm up to lately, locally and beyond. I have, of course, in my Shameless Commerce division, recently had this published as the 3rd edition, and then of course promptly the economy shut down and the opportunity to meet with people in person and sell them books and so forth evaporated. But this is what it's more about where I've been and what I've done in the past, but I'm continuing that work. And The continuing work is through organizations like the Vermont Healthy Soils Coalition, which I mentioned earlier as my focus on soil health as the leading way to mitigate climate change. The Grassroots Center for Organizing, a land-based activist training and regenerative agriculture center that's newly established nearby where the Chodorkovs lived in Marshfield, Vermont. And the idea of food and medicine sovereignty is also important in my activities now. I'm working with Pamela Boyce Sims and the Community Supported Enlightenment Network as one of their projects is a Singularity Botanicals, a company that's producing herbal medicines that will support in particular the needs of the African diaspora community, the health needs, and they are creating products and practices and self-care instructions and cultivation instructions for all of their medicines, and distributing these all of these things free at this point just in the Chester, Pennsylvania community, which is a very hard hit Black population center. So I'll post links to those organizations later on as well. I just wanted to kind of conclude with an example of the most inspirational intersection of community resiliency in response to the climate emergency and the push for food sovereignty, which was when I was able to travel to Puerto Rico in 2018, 2 years ago, just 6 months after the hurricane, which Brian mentioned, and was hosted by my dear friend and former student Nelson Alvarez Febles, who is an amazing leader in the agroecology and food sovereignty movement there in Puerto Rico at this time. So this is the example, this is the food access and where I visited several farmers markets around the island that were thriving, still having a lot of difficulty with crops that they traditionally would have had, but were completely wiped out. There were no fruits at all, locally produced fruits. All of the crops were either annual greens that were coming in or root crops that had been in the ground already before the hurricane ripped them out. And these folks are just were amazing. The organizers, most of the organizers of these markets and of the organization, I'm terrible, Burikwa, which is the primary organic agroecological organization, are amazing women. And I have a lot to say about how the leadership of women and women of color has been taking off also in the last few years. And this is the farm end, and it's a farm collective, Siembra de Tres Vidas, one of the farms that I visited. And there are 3 women who are the Tres Vidas of the title, and who are the collective members. And down in the corner here is Nelson and one of their farm workers, Edwin, helping create a really beautiful permaculture-based setup. And down in this corner here, I just have a little picture that gives an indication of some of the devastation to the landscape that was still in existence, still obvious 6 months later. So my concluding statement really is that this is all working towards a vision of what could be, and what we can do is to support these kinds of projects as activists, as farmers, gardeners, as consumers. And I think that being a consumer is not the worst thing in the world, but it is lower down on the list of things that you can do to help. There are lists of BIPOC-owned food businesses available in various places. I just saw one for Vermont this morning. It's mostly restaurants in Burlington, but you know, it's a start. And there are numerous ideas and organizations and projects that crop up that I hear about every day. I just this morning donated to something called the Susu Healing Collective in Brattleboro, Vermont, which is attempting to put together land specifically for the BIPOC community, and is doing at this point a community healing space very much like the Singularity Botanicals work that Pamela Boyce-Sims is doing. So it's happening, and it is really, I think, the leading edge of the revolution that requires participatory democracy, decentralized systems of mutual aid, and needs to be part of our ongoing. This is going to be our new normal, folks. This is how we're going to protect and enhance the revolution that we need on the ground. So with that, I will turn it back to our discussion forum. And I haven't been looking at the chat or anything, so I'm hoping you've got some good questions and comments to offer. Thank you.
Yeah. First, thank you, Grace, for pulling all of that together. Many themes to think about. There were three main issues that I think came up in the discussion in the chat, and then I have a follow-up question as well. There was a specific question about the role of soil with respect to climate, and particularly the impact of agricultural practices that involve bare soil in excess emissions. There was some dialogue at various points about the question of animal agriculture and how we think about animal agriculture relative to more plant-based food production. And then there was some discussion back and forth among various people about the role of factory farms in the whole conversation. And then the question that I had, and your discussion about your visit to Puerto Rico partly answered it, but of all of the various examples and experiments that you're aware of in many places, what are some of the ones that most, in your view, fulfill and are most conscious about the long-range revolutionary potential of agriculture and food-based movements?
Well, certainly I would point to our local example of the Grassroots Center for Organizing, which is explicitly about agriculture and food-based movements as the leading edge of the revolution. And I think that the Vermont Healthy Soils Coalition, to a large extent, is conscious of that, although trying to maintain a big tent coalition building with people who may have different political outlooks, but are interested in soil as the focus of their activities. So certainly most of the BIPOC-led work, certainly the organizations such as Via Campesina that you are very familiar with have an explicitly revolutionary orientation. I mean, the Detroit Food and Agriculture Alliance of Black, I can never get the correct nomenclature for that. That one of our former students, John Gruchala, was instrumental in helping originate back in the 70s. I think he's been working there. And certainly projects such as Soul Fire Farm and Cooperation Jackson, who were here with us, was it last year or 2 years ago now? I'm forgetting.
That was last year.
It was last year, and they're certainly very, very engaged both with symbiosis and with self-help and land trust and food sovereignty projects as well. So I think that there's quite a resurgence, as I think people have noted before, of explicitly anti-capitalist, explicitly, transformational, as opposed to merely fixing the system as it is projects. In terms of the questions of soil and agriculture and livestock, I mean, those debates go deep, wide, and furious in many quarters. So I am definitely on the end of, or the side of the proponent of increasing regenerative animal livestock practices as a means of improving soil. I studied with Alan Savory, who created the concept of holistic management, and has influenced a great many people. There's folks from Soil for Climate, the Soil Carbon Coalition, and other groups like that who are specifically interested in the idea of building soil to mitigate climate change, and who advocate appropriate management of livestock as one of the key requirements to regenerate arid land pastures. Pasture land which is not arable, which is not soil that should be ever tilled up, accounts for a larger proportion of our managed farmland than does the arable land, and a large proportion of it is under increasing drought pressure and desertifying. I think something like 40% is under threat of drought-based degradation, and the best way to restore those lands is through intensive livestock management in a way that mimics the way they co-evolved with large herds of ruminants. So that's kind of a summary of that idea, which I urge you to explore independently. And you know, there's so much information out there, and some of it is contradictory, and it can be very confusing, and some of it's misleading. So I find that sorting it out and looking at everything critically is really the only way that we can understand it and work with it. Certainly bare soil, impervious surfaces, which is most urban land, are all ways in which land is degraded, and that results in the problems that we are facing in terms of climate catastrophe. It's one of the primary causes. I think I'll stop there.
Peter Musakewa had a follow-up question on the role of Black people in U.S. agriculture. Peter, do you want to state your question?
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much. Now, yes, I was just following up on the sharing, wondering maybe as a person who is living in this hemisphere. So I just wanted to hear a little more on the status of farming, especially in the Black community. Were they involved actually in farming, or there were no Black farmers at all?
Well,
if not, what was the reason in the farm?
Well, historically, there's been a belief, and this was particularly highlighted by, I'm losing her name, The Color of Food, the author of The Color of Food, who recognized that, you know, brown people, Black people were not that interested in getting involved in agriculture because it had the aura of slavery about it, because working the land was seen as demeaning and was part of the racist past that they wanted to get away from. And so that has been changing primarily through organizations and leadership among various people, the folks in Detroit, Malik Yakini and some of the other leaders there, Karen Washington, and in the urban gardening movement, and she's also moved into upper state New York to develop a more urban-rural connection. Certainly Leah Penniman has been the star of that movement. Training Soulfire Farm, which has been around since I think 2010 or 2012, set up for specifically to train BIPOC folks in agriculture, and is turning out more and more and more trainees who are looking for land and starting projects all over the place. And it's just exploding very rapidly, and it's amazing. The community food sovereignty has also been becoming more and more of an issue, certainly right now. And the relationship of the food that we eat to the decline, the vulnerability of BIPOC populations and urban populations has become very clear to many people, and the need for access to land and land justice has become very clear to more of the BIPOC community. Thus, the reparations map, the Northeast Farmers of Color Land Trust, and similar movements, I'm sure, in other parts of the country. I would cite the work of Food First, the organization in Oakland and the Bay Area that has really pioneered raising the policy issues about racial justice in the food system as well. So yes, it's really, really expanding, and it's very, very heartening to see that happening. Thank you for the question.
I would add that there
Thank you very much.
is a surviving sector of Black farmers in the American South that has managed to survive over the past century. In the 1960s, there was an important effort to create a federation of cooperatives to encourage people to, especially Black farmers, to develop cooperative forms of ownership, because for many years, because of the way U.S. agriculture has become increasingly centralized in ownership, with, in the case of many key commodities, only a handful of corporations controlling production, and farmers increasingly driven into debt. Farmers have been forced off the land, and of course Black farmers have been disproportionately forced off the land. So the Federation of Southern Cooperatives in the 1960s tried to counter that trend and develop systems for people to stay on the land, and they've had some limited success, but it continues to be a struggle. The main scholar on that history is somebody named Jessica Nembhard, Nembhard. I can also write it in the chat.
Yeah, and part of the story of the Sherrods and the New Communities Land Trust is that they lost that farm, they lost that land, I think in the 80s during the farm crisis of that era, and were part of the successful suit against USDA for discrimination in farm lending practices. At Pigford versus Glickman was the USDA suit that they finally won, and finally got a settlement, and were able, based on that settlement, to buy a new piece of land in Georgia and restart the New Communities Farm Project only in the last few years. And so that's, the Federation of Southern Cooperatives, Land Loss Prevention Project, a number of other affiliated efforts have attempted to protect Black farmers from the loss of their land, but that has been the fate of small family farmers in this country for a long time, which has been even worse for Black farmers. So to see those trends being reversed, it's gonna take more revolutionary movements to really get the grip of agribusiness and the land grabbing, even in this country, the ownership. I just saw some statistic recently that like the mutual fund of TIAA, which is a major retirement fund for like Harvard University and most academic endowments, owns like a huge amount of farmland. It's been buying up farmland as an investment in the Midwest. So that's just one example. Very few, even the large farmers, they don't own their land. Most of it is leased. So just it's absentee owned land primarily.
So it's 11 o'clock. There's been some continuing discussion in the chat about, excuse me, the animal agriculture question. I don't know if that's something you want to spend more time on in the large group, or if you'd prefer to go right to small groups at this time.
I really think that there's not going to be any definitive answer on the animal agriculture given in 5 minutes or 5 days of discussion. So I would just like to be able to get into hearing about what the folks who are in this group are doing in their own communities. I think that's what it's all about.
Okay, I will post the breakout questions again in the chat, and then there's 35 of us, so let's say 4 or 5 groups. Okay, I think we're all back. Let me just close that. And some people joined late during the breakouts, and I tried to pop people into breakouts as I got notifications. So I hope that worked out okay for folks who have just joined in the last 5 or 10 minutes. Grace, do you want to facilitate report backs?
Okay, well, I think mine was group 1, so why don't we start out with that? Alex was taking notes. Go.
Actually, it was Nori, so Nori can hopefully report back.
Oh, okay.
Okay, I thought you let me off the hook there. All right, so during our introductions, we talked about, as I understood, looking at my notes, many of us don't have very deep involvement in food activism, but we do things like volunteer at food kitchens, interested in helping with food gardens, working with food co-ops. It intersects a lot of our mutual aid work, like coordinating food collections to take food, to help stock food banks that are struggling, and are basically politicized and eco-anarchist climate movements. So yes, also one person mentioned being a vegan, and that, which is a personal choice, but that's also very informative. Yeah, so a lot of interest in food systems and so on. Now for strategies to take back to our communities, we discussed, Jeff's idea in the chat during the talk was very interesting. So he mentioned that average farmer did 60 acres and now has to do 5,000 acres because of increasing production costs.
I think it's 500.
Oh, 500, excuse me. Yes, that would be very unmanageable, excuse me. We talked about sort of anti-capitalist ecological movements in general. And while we felt, at least some of us felt that, not directly a detailed way touching on the food subject itself. They're certainly related. And we talked about also strategy, like meeting people where they're at. People is definitely in people's lived experience. So that's something you can talk with people about, lack of healthy food and so on. We discussed that the way we eat food right now is pretty atomized, so that people's experience of food oftentimes is like going to a store, bringing it home, and eating it alone or with atomic family. What would happen if we had it in a more communal way, where we would eat with others, and you would think that some of our conversations might start touching upon the logistics of it all, the supply of it, and so on. Another person mentioned the co-op movement, and was just taking a course on that, as I understand. So, asking fundamental questions like, this isn't like in the British co-op movement, like, where does tea come from, Apparently co-ops benefited from slavery and colonialism, and so there's like a critique of co-ops that perhaps even Bookchin mentioned. And I believe, yeah, that I'll stop there, and on to the next person.
Okay, group 2. Anybody?
I don't think people necessarily know what their number was.
Don't know what their number was. Well, who wants to go next?
I can go next for my group. In my group, we had Maxlin, Victoria, Joshu, Jan, Johanna, and then Katie came in a little bit later. We had kind of varying levels of connection issues with people, but still had a good conversation. So Johanna mentioned her involvement with regenerative agriculture movement and the importance of mother and child health. She has a personal garden that works with the CSA and is working on higher education curriculum within nursing students and access to local food and growth. If anybody in my group, also Johanna, anybody else has anything that they want to chip in, please feel free in case I missed anything. Joshu is also working on growing his own food. And some of the questions that arose during the time that kind of piqued everybody's interest is Victoria and Joshu brought up the intersectionality of not just food sovereignty, but all forms of sovereignty, including land sovereignty, water sovereignty, because you can't have one without all, and that personally really stood out to me. Johanna mentioned bridging the gap between gut health and soil health, and the importance of biodiversity within our stomachs to help people's immunities flourish, and you need healthy food and healthy soil in order to maintain that. Jan had brought up many good points about racism in food justice, how that intersects. They were located in Germany, and the food systems there, and I know in many countries too, United States included, are based on the exploitation of migrant labor, and that was really the appearance of that was really exacerbated by the COVID crisis, as COVID broke out within meat plants, which is happening where I live as well, and how much cheap, basically, slave labor is used within the food systems in Germany, including even on the organic co-ops within his area. We also discussed the mutual aid networks. I brought up the Food Not Bombs network in my area, distributing foods to families. They've been distributing food to low-income families for a long time, but especially now during the COVID crisis. And I don't think I really have much more to add. If anybody else wants to add anything to the chat, please feel free.
Thank you. Who's next?
Three more groups.
Three more.
Brian, I can take our group next, and just moving through it quickly because we had a lot of introductions and a lot of questions. We had Owen from New Haven, Nick, Jeff from Sequapemculu of the interior British Columbia, Brian in central Vermont, Marielle from Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and I did not get the name of the First Nations people that used to occupy that land or it was stolen from, but she did mention it. Musa Kiwe from Zimbabwe, and we had a lot of varying experiences. So some people have worked in some organizations that some people have probably heard about, like Food Not Bombs, or Owen's involved with this sort of anarchist but very cool organization, the Catholic Workers, who provide these vegan meals. A lot of us have been involved in CSAs. Nick wants to start a nursery production system. Jeff grew up in an organic and movement environment and has a degree in sustainable agriculture and has worked on both industrial farms and regenerative operations. Brian, teaches a class on international and domestic food movements at UVM and has been involved in like related projects at ISC. Marielle works with urban gardens and food justice initiatives led by BIPOC in Milwaukee. Musa Kiwe looks at how people are growing their food around the mountains, the water that comes from the mountains and the streams around the area in Zimbabwe, and also researches indigenous diets and indigenous plants and tries to bring back those plants as sort of a healthy and nutritious option and sort of revival option, and studies local agricultural practices, which I thought was very interesting. And sort of Owen's comments were sort of about some of the internal divides that we see in some of these movements, like for instance, between permaculture and veganism, and kind of how we can create more cohesiveness in these movements. And Marielle's was sort of interested because she wants to know more about like not only how farming works, but sort of how we can overcome this sort of scarcity feeling between farmers and consumers and help people fall in love with being a part of food production, as a community or neighborhood. Nick wants to know like how we can, like wants to plan out what types of plants we're making and how to make those plants accessible and do it in a way that's not extracting more resources than necessary. Jeff is interested in the area of heritage genetics in livestock and crops, and the fact that a lot of locally adopted genetics and the impact that that has on the amount of resources needed to produce food, right? So he's interested in that because of the differences that heritage, right? And that makes a huge difference, he said, between degenerative and organic systems. So I might be botching that one a little bit. I asked about the difference between or exploring more this idea of food justice and land sovereignty. And Brian recommended some resources from Food First on how to think through food justice versus the food sovereignty frame. And that was Raj Patel and Eric Hold Jimenez, and how to think about the food movement in a more holistic way. And Musa Kiwe was interested in two main questions, which is one, the idea of how to combine farming and grazing, and the idea that grazing does not have to lead to desertification. But he also asked about how viable is organic farming at the commercial scale. And Brian recommended some resources from the Rodale Institute, which he says is one of the pioneers of organic agriculture in the US, and that they've done some research on how to scale up organic production, in case anyone else is interested in that as well.
Thank you.
Who's next? We have 2 more groups to report. Question. Who hasn't told us about their conversation yet?
I can step in for group 3. I wasn't taking extensive notes, but we had a really productive conversation. So there were 6 of us. I don't know if our friend from Hawaii is connected to the chat anymore, but there were 6 and then
I am.
5 of us. Oh, you are? Oh, there you are. No,
I'm
sorry.
back, yeah.
There you are. Hi. Glad your phone
Thanks.
is working.
Yep.
So if you guys want to jump in at any time and expand on what I'm going to summarize in case I'm missing any points, let me know. But we talked a little bit about Wild Heart is up. What region of Canada are you in again, Wild Heart?
I'm on North Vancouver Island, and I'm on the territory of the Quagulth people. They're people with a big house and a canoe. I work for them.
What was that work you were doing about ending the genocidal levels of salmon fishing there? 'Cause that was really interesting.
I was doing a lot of work with Indigenous food sovereignty in Vancouver before I moved to the islands, and mostly around the wild salmon caravan with a woman, Dawn Morrison. She's actually Shuswap, where Jeff is from. And yeah, that was about standing up against farm fish and the way that the DFO, the Department of Fisheries and Oceans, harvest the fish stocks. And what, I forget now.
That was about the gist of it.
And the way that the wild salmon are being eradicated and not maintained is the same genocide that took place for the buffalo in the plains.
So that was really important work. Haya talked a little bit about her experience with La Conf, food justice movement in France. Did you want to talk a little bit more about that, Haya? That was really interesting.
I don't think it makes sense to talk about it. It's called La Confédération Paysanne. Their nickname is La Conf. It's the Peasants' Confederation. That's how in French. They're still the biggest union of farmers in France that started self-identifying in the 70s as peasants. And they helped co-found La Via Campesina, and they coined the term food sovereignty. And I wrote a book about this called Food Farms and Solidarity, if you want to look at how the term food sovereignty came about and how there were a lot of debates about what would be a good term to express that. That they didn't want sustainable agriculture. It was a big thing. And they had to come up with a new idea that was really interesting.
I loved that narrative. Yeah, that was really cool to hear about. Myself and Max, we both talked a little bit about the nature of the typical American community garden and how there really actually isn't too much community in the community garden. I think the term Max uses public-private, and the term I used was neoliberal, which I think both point to the essence of how the community garden is structured into many different plots, and you're in charge of your own little plot. So there is no solidaric actual food production taking place. And personally, I would love to try and push the community garden ethos into the realm of actual community, of actual solidaric action and collective agriculture practices that I think could be a really productive, potentially revolutionary field to work in here in the U.S., considering that almost every town has a community garden, and it wouldn't be too much of an intellectual leap for most people to try to actually put the community into community gardening. So that would be something fantastic. And I hope I'm not forgetting anybody. Noelle, if you wanted to talk a little bit about your experiences in Hawaii, the Breadfruit project, the tree giveaway that you mentioned seemed really interesting.
Oh, yeah. So, yeah, I could go on forever about Hawaii because it's so different and unique. But yeah, they have a breadfruit tree giveaway, which is an ulu tree. And breadfruit is like this big, and they call it, it's like bread, but it's not really like bread. It's a starch. And everybody here thinks that it's the plant that could save the world from food instability, because it just produces so much food for one tree, and it's like a tree of life. And it grows, you know, in more tropical regions, obviously. So Southeast Asia, Mexico, that band around the world. But yeah, so here they're making babies and call them keiki and give them away so people can just plant them everywhere. And we have guerrilla gardening here all over the place. And we also have lots of weeds. So.
Fantastic stuff. And I think that just about sums up our group if the next one would like to go.
Thank you. And who's got the last word on the groups? One more group that hasn't gone.
Well, if there's nobody to report, maybe we should just move into addressing some of these questions and wrapping up then.
Yeah, I guess that's what we should do. If somebody wakes up and decides that they have a
I don't think our group went. We didn't designate a person, I think.
Okay, thank you.
I didn't write down anything really, but so our group, we talked about a few things. I think Laura was in our group. She talked about her work with the vegan movement in the Palestinian territories and what she's doing with that. I think it was Jeffrey, I'm not sure if I'm getting these names right, in Paris, talking about how there was land allotted for, I think he said, the development of an airport, and how they sort of co-opted it into being used for local agriculture. Blair was in our group. He talked about kind of this idea of, he had worries about some of the things in terms of what we're talking about with regards to localism, and if it's adequately like challenging capitalist frameworks or just kind of playing into it. That's how I understood that, I guess. And then one thing I said was that I think land, sometimes we talk about it too simply, and that it's not like you just buy a piece of property and start growing food on it. I think Grace talked about there's things like leasing. We saw in our documentary over the weekend, things like there's mineral rights underneath land, and you can think you own the land, but then it's taken away from you. So there are these sorts of issues that come up that make talking about food in relation to land a little bit more complicated, at least in the United States, and I would imagine in other countries too. So I'll just leave it at that, unless anyone else from the group has something to add.
Good, thank you. Lots to chew on, so to speak. Sorry. I've been trying to insert a few of my resources in the chat, but I think what will make more sense is to be able to upload a whole list of resources somewhere or other where you can access them when we're all done. Brian, did you notice any other questions coming up that we can wrap up with?
There were 2 points that I thought I'd say a little bit more about. One is the question of co-ops, and the other is the issue that Blair raised, which is a really important one, of how many of these currents often get co-opted by the commercial food system. I think co-ops are a crucial part of the conversation, and of course co-ops take different forms in different settings, in different sectors of the economy. There are, of course, co-ops primarily of people acting in their role as producers, and there are consumer co-ops. And in both cases, in different times and places in different parts of the world, there's been tremendous liberatory potential, and there's been a radical edge to various co-op movements. And there's also been a tendency for co-ops, both in the consumer sector and the producer sector, as it were, to be co-opted and to become part of the commercially driven and commercially controlled food system. Certainly in the US, I saw an early stage of the food co-op, food consumer co-op movement, when it was fairly radical and explicitly framed as an alternative to and a direct opposition to the mainstream food system, at a time when what we think of as natural foods were hardly available, where people really had to make an effort to make them available in various parts of the country. And increasingly, they've become part of the commercial natural foods industry. And there's been tremendous concentration. All the co-ops where we live in Vermont have become completely dependent on large corporations that control the distribution system for organic and natural foods. And there's also an important critique of the local food movement, which in many sectors and many places has sort of become a form of boosterism for local business, and has put aside the more political and more justice-centered aspects that originally brought people toward embracing local food as an alternative. So I think Blair has posted a number of quotes and sources on that discussion, which continues to be a crucially important one. There are a couple of important academic articles on the critique of local food that I can post to the Discord platform. And if people aren't familiar with that, Alex has been posting the link, but for folks who aren't on it, there's been a lot of follow-up discussion in many different topics, and people have been posting resources and links to full texts of various sources, etc. And we can talk more about that in the wrap-up session this afternoon.
And I would want to add a couple of other comments to that, Brian. Thank you. And thank you, Blair, for posting all of that information, particularly Raj Patel, who is a great commentator. I've posted a link to the Food First analysis on racial justice in the food system, which I note is 4 years old now. So there's, I'm sure, updates from Food First as well available. But the problem of co-optation into capitalism can sometimes be, you know, a bit too divisive. And I think that the people who've been talking about trying to meet people where they're at made a point of saying that when you come at people in a community with an anti-capitalist framework as your primary organizing tool, you're not going to get a lot of buy-in, although to use a silly metaphor, but that there is more open critique of capitalism out there in the mainstream, but in most communities, the question is really one of how do we support each other and survive, and that is really where I think the local food movement came from. I don't think it was so much coming, I mean, there certainly was a lot of political motivation in most of these movements, but some of it is not so progressive and some of it is not so leftist. And the value of understanding when you are having to compromise in order to reach people, and not being taken over by that need to just survive. I mean, we're all having to survive in one way or another in a capitalist economy, and make concessions and use those mechanisms in order to reach more people. And I always use the example of, you know, the organic seal on the packages in the supermarket that a lot of people are believe doesn't have any meaning anymore. Well, it does have a meaning, and it means that people who are used to seeing whatever kind of, you know, national name brand product that is their loved comfort food that can be produced in massive quantities without resorting to destroying the earth and you know, spraying toxins on farm workers and so on and so forth. They begin a process of waking up, of understanding that there's something wrong here if they can get that stuff without needing to be compromising environment and health and so on. It isn't the ultimate answer. It isn't at all challenging capitalism, but it is also a form of mass education that that begins a journey for many people.
Forrest had a question or comment.
Yeah, so I wanted to ask, just like, we've had some conversations about co-ops and autonomous zones, and I agree. I think one of the reasons that they fail is I think they don't go far enough. And I think, so honestly, I come from West Texas. It has the largest cattle yard in the entire world. The #1 cattle yard is in Hereford, Texas. You can literally fucking smell it. When the wind blows in West Texas, you can literally say you can smell Hereford, right? And I had when I was a kid, I had debate courses over there, right? We would have debate tournaments and it smelled terrible, right? It was clear that that shit was evil, right? Okay, so now with these autonomous zones and stuff like this, I think the reason they fail is because they get co-opted, because we don't take the next step. And I mean, it's a bit hardcore, but I think the next step would be, I don't know, in Hereford, there are out in West Texas, you can start a small cooperative farm, right? You get enough people on it, and I would say go over and raid the Hereford cattle farm and take cattle. Now that would be really intense, I agree. But one thing is though, and I think, okay, also pretty Texan thing to say, but no one would remember the Alamo if they had surrendered. They knew they were gonna die. I think it was like something like 300 people against 2,000. They knew they were gonna die. Just like the Black Panther Party stood up, most of them knew they were gonna die. Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X, they knew they were gonna die. And they took that risk. And to be honest, I think we're getting to the point where it's like, why aren't things getting better? I mean, we've got like the environment is completely shot to hell. Black people are shot to hell. Why? Where is that? Like, where is? I think at some point we have to say, are we going to make a stand or not?
Do we have any closing thoughts that maybe aren't quite as dire? You know, we could look at things a little bit differently when we see some of the work that's being done in many countries, including the US. I think failure in one sense is also part of the dialectic of regeneration and evolution to another form in another sense. That's all I can say about it. Brian, do you have any?
You know, we live in scary times and we live in encouraging times and we live in transformative times, and there's a lot to be impatient about and there's a lot to be angry about because the world is being stolen from everybody, from almost everybody. And, you know, I think we continue to point to movements that have both the ability to challenge the system and have a longer range vision of a different way of being. And watching those movements and supporting those movements and participating in those movements are some of the ways that we're able to, as I said yesterday, keep our eyes on the prize for the longer term. And I think that's where some hope lies. I'll point out for folks who haven't been following the chat that there's been some ongoing dialogue and exchange of resources about the question of co-ops. It's definitely a theme that, as there are many themes that have come out this whole time, this whole 5 days, that need a lot more discussion. So this afternoon, we're going to have our wrap up. It's hard to believe it's been 5+ days since we've been meeting together. We'll have some wrap up discussion. We'll have some small group time. We'll have some conversations about how people who wish to can get more involved in the ISE. Some discussion of what we have coming up after this week. And I hope everybody can join us this afternoon. Any further things to share from anybody about the plans for this afternoon?
Yeah,
which are
I just want to
somewhat
say that,
in evolution.
yeah, I want to say that one of the really lovely things about the intensives potentially is that people can, you know, meet each other. And if you were face to face, it'd be easier to do. But we really want these forums to be spaces for people to forge new connections with people. And because we're all in some version of lockdown in our lives, maybe having relationships with people online through listservs or Zoom groups or whatever, it would be lovely when we get together later today to figure out how for people to collectively, voluntarily make subgroups that might be around common interests that people have, maybe subgroups that are organized around either geographical groups, organizing groups, maybe people who want to create study groups together. And we'll talk more also about how to join existing study groups that the ISC offers and how to literally become an active member of the ISC. The idea of this is we want to keep you. We love you. You're awesome. It's been an incredible set of days, and we want to figure out how for you to stay connected with each other and with the ISC too. I just want to also say something, you know, to speak to Forrest's comment, and I don't see your comment as being doomsday or negative. I think it's accurate. You know, we're in a horror show. I mean, we're in a pandemic where we have a president who is allowing thousands of people, and there's going to be, you know, there's going to be thousands and thousands of particularly Black or brown people who are going to die from this. And it is so excruciating to watch this. It's excruciating to see how people who are living in chronic poverty and exposed to racism and heteropatriarchy in all its gruesome forms, it's a very intense time. And I agree, I'm not heartened. You know, I was a little heartened by the protest. Where they're going in the directions now are not giving me all that much hope, but I can say that we have to keep our eyes on the long-term prize. And what I would just say to folks, and I don't know how well we at the ISC have done this 5 days, but I feel like the question of political power has to stay central. It can't just be that we're anti-capitalist or that we come on later and say, well, we're not, we'll tell you later that we're anti-capitalist. I think we have to be very clear, at least among ourselves, as how do we talk about political power, how to get it, how to institutionalize. If we can't institutionalize our forms of freedom, we're really not going to get into anything that resembles revolution. And so the term revolutionary gets bandied about a lot, but a revolutionary trajectory requires having a minimum program of where you are. And you might go to your, you know, the people at the community garden who are not interested in capitalism. And your minimum program for that might simply be, let's create a community garden. And then you have a transitional program that is a little more radical than your maximum program. And there's a way to roll that out within a community that makes sense and has what we call an action logic to it. Doesn't mean you go in as anarchists that are anti-statist, anti-capitalist. It might not be how the best, you know, messaging works. But I just want to say, I believe the revolutionary process, it's alive, it's in us. It's basically about taking empathy and freedom and turning it into institutional practices that are our organizations. And I believe we can do that. And that is where the help, you know, that the hope lies. And hopefully all of you, you know, have taken away some of that and read more about communalism and read more about Rojava and read more about how people have successfully wrested real power. Because I don't believe we're going to co-op our way to a revolution. I don't believe we're going to protest our way to a revolution. I don't believe we're going to reform our way to a revolution. I don't. I think we do have to figure out how to wrest political power. And I sadly don't think it's going to be about insurrectionary Civil War grade movements either. So just get curious about communalist politics. I'm always available. You can always email me. I'm happy to chat with anybody. And yeah, hope to see you guys later after our break. Definitely come back.
Thanks, Kaya. And I'll just I totally support what you've said, and support the idea of looking beyond our personal lifetimes timeline and our personal survival timeline. That is really an important part of what I have been fortunate to derive from my work with Pamela. And my bumper sticker is still relevant, and that's, there's no hope, but maybe I'm wrong. So thank you all. And I'll look forward to seeing you in some forum or other, maybe this afternoon for a bit, but I've really appreciated all of your involvements. Thank you so much.
Yeah, hope to see everybody this afternoon. We'll be starting up again in an hour and 20 minutes. If you're not able to join us this afternoon, I just want to put in one plug. The next thing we have running is a several-week reading group, reading The Ecology of Freedom together. So I hope people think about joining us for that and various other things that we'll be talking about later on.
And join the mailing list for ISE.
See you in a few hours. Bye.
Bye, everybody.
I would like to make a final pitch, shameless commerce. if people have found this valuable, if you have already contributed, made a small contribution to the Institute to support our work, I greatly appreciate it. If you haven't, even if you can contribute $10 or $20, it goes a long way towards helping us continue doing this kind of educational work, which I think is really the key to the kind of revolutionary change that we seek. Every revolutionary project is an educational project. So thank you.
Yes, thanks for that.
Thanks. Bye, everyone.
See everybody in a while.
Bye.
Okay.